It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce Gordon Martin Jr., who is something of a hero of mine, although I'm not going to embarrass him too much, but someone who has made history in this country as a civil rights activist, as a lawyer, a moral conscience for the country during a time of great turmoil and ever since that time. Gordon Martin served as a Massachusetts trial judge for 21 years before retiring. During the Kennedy administration, he was one of a dozen lawyers who was sent down south to Mississippi to work on voting rights cases and other intimidation and discrimination cases for the Civil Rights Division of Robert Kennedy's Justice Department. In that capacity, he prepared the United States versus Theron Lind case, the first of the department's voting rights cases, to bring the Mississippi Registry of Voters into line with civil rights laws.
Or
try to, yes, exactly. Martin also investigated hunger in the Mississippi Delta and discrimination in southern states overall. Upon returning to Massachusetts, he was the first assistant United States attorney and later special assistant to Senator Ted Kennedy and a commissioner of the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, one of the three oldest such divisions and commissions, anti-discrimination agencies in the United States. In 2000, Martin was visiting professor at the University of Mississippi Law School, teaching civil rights and legal ethics. He is currently an adjunct professor at New England School of Law here in Boston, where he teaches civil rights and community courts. He has co-authored a civil rights casebook and dozens of articles and op-eds and reviews and so forth. His book, count them one by one, Black Mississippians Fight for the Right to Vote, is an astonishing book, a stirring account of the voting rights work that was done in Mississippi when he was just a very, very young man and a very young lawyer. He had just passed the bar about a year and a half before he went to Mississippi and was dispatched there in the early 1960s, really when the civil rights movement was reaching a sort of early fever pitch. This book was published by the University Press of Mississippi in 2010. In 2009, I should mention that he won the Humanitarian Award of the Choral Arts Society of Washington at its annual tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin is a graduate of Roxbury Latin here in Boston, Harvard College, and New York University School of Law, and he lives here in Boston with his wonderful wife Stephanie, with whom he has been married and partnered for half a century. They have 4 adult children together. So Gordon, it's really my pleasure to introduce you and to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Tim. I've got to make one correction. It's the heroes and heroines are the people who have the courage to go and try to vote.
Yeah.
When they were risking their lives, they were risking their economic well-being, and one of my 16 African-American witnesses was murdered by the White Knights of the Klan, a group based just north of Forest County in Warren, Mississippi.
Yeah, let's go back to that time. I mean, this is a stirring book for a number of reasons. For someone who didn't live during that time but has studied that time and has taught about that time. In fact, just last week I was talking about Mississippi and Mississippi Freedom Summer and civil disobedience and Martin Luther King. And this is a book that is both very present in the sense that it really accounts for and brings us up to the present day. You refer several occasions to Barack Obama's historic election in 2008. And this is a book that you were motivated to write, to go back to Mississippi, to go back to the place where you had done this important voting rights work in the early 60s. Talk a little bit about your motivation for this book, what you were trying to accomplish in going back and interviewing the people who were still alive, you were working with, or their descendants. To just tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write it.
Well, I really wanted people to be aware of the fact that this was not a movement that was purely Dr. King and Roy Wilkins and Congressman Lewis and James Farmer, as great as they were in the work that they did. But it was a grassroots movement. It was people who wanted to participate in our democracy, who wanted to vote. And thus they risked everything by going down to the circuit clerk's office. In Mississippi, the circuit clerk is the registrar of voters, and attempting to be voters in the state of Mississippi.
And what made you want to write this book now, right? 27 years later, was there any sort of particular historical convergence or something that inspired you to do it? Were there people who were getting in touch with you who said you should write this book or tell our story?
Really, it flowed out of a seminar that I took at New York University, and one specifically on race and nationality in modern America. And I was the only non-academic in the group. And every academic, as you well know, has a project, multiple projects.
Yes.
But I didn't have a project, and I decided my project was going to be going and finding my witnesses. And only one, David Roberson, whom we'll see in the video in a few minutes, had left the state of Mississippi. Vernon Dahmer had been assassinated. One witness had committed suicide for reasons unrelated to the case. One had moved to Jackson, where he was an elementary school principal, but most were still right there in Forest County, with Hattiesburg as the county seat.
I want to talk a little bit about this. One of the things that's striking about this book, and one of the things that I think is striking about the civil rights movement as a movement, is that it combines so many different kinds of forces of activism. Right? That you had on the one hand lawyers like yourself, people who are working in legal capacities to challenge the laws, the discrimination laws, the Jim Crow laws at the time. You also had, and perhaps a little bit slower to the case, people in the realm of politics and public policy who were willing to come on board with the civil rights movement. At some point, obviously, it took a little bit of time to get there in some cases, at the federal level I'm talking about. And then you also have, as you just mentioned, this enormous kind of groundswell of grassroots organizing, this ordinary men and women sort of rising up against this system that really had deep, profound control over their lives. And so I want you to talk a little bit, to take us back to the moment when you kind of get there. You're dispatched to Mississippi, you get there, you're a young civil rights division lawyer. Take us through that landscape of these different forces that are operating.
Well, let's go back even farther than that for a few minutes and go back to the first Reconstruction, because what we're talking about with the civil rights movement is quite properly known as the second Reconstruction. But back in that period, the immediate post-Civil War period, we had the three great amendments: the 13th, abolishing slavery; the 14th, the Equal Protection Clause; and then the 15th, the right to vote. And that should have resolved it. Why would we need legislation half a century, a full century later? But part two of the 15th Amendment, which we'll also see in the video, was that Congress could enact legislation that would implement the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. And it didn't really happen until a convergence of Herbert Brownell, President Eisenhower's first Attorney General, and Lyndon Johnson, in his great role with the majority leader of the Senate, agreed that first in 1956 when it didn't pass, and then in 1957 when it did, the first Civil Rights Act of the 20th century. And that gave me and the other young lawyers in the Civil Rights Division a tool and the justification to be able to bring that lawsuit against their end. And things changed in the last year of the Eisenhower administration. Any new statute, it was awfully important because we had the United States Commission on Civil Rights created in that bill, and the Civil Rights Unit, actually it was called the Civil Liberties Unit that Frank Murphy had created when he was Attorney General, became a division. And you need a division to have club. Being an orphan in the criminal division is not good enough. So we had then legislation, and when Harold Tyler became the Assistant Attorney General, he was the third Assistant Attorney General in the division, and he was the last one of the Eisenhower administration, and picked John Doerr as his first assistant, a Princeton classmate. Things changed, because basically the way the division had operated was to sit back in Washington and wait for reports to come in. FBI reports out of a U.S. Attorney's office in the particular district. And instead, John Doerr and Burt Marshall, who succeeded Tyler as the first Kennedy Assistant Attorney General, put young, new lawyers into the field, knocking on doors. I I think it's fair to say that while there's a lot of competency in FBI agents, that rapport with the black community in the South was not one of their great skills.
Yeah.
And it was something that we had because we cared. And I think it became very clear to the witnesses that we dealt with that we really cared about them, cared about their having the right to participate, or had the right, of implementing that right to participate in the life of our country.
Yeah. And you mentioned that so many of the witnesses are still living in Forest County, still living in California. One of the things that strikes me, and I've done a lot of work in the South myself, not as much as you've done, but some. And one of the things that strikes me in the South is it is so very local. And while there are real aspirations among local people all over the South, particularly black folks in the South, there's also a sense that there's a very long history of racism that's sort of bearing down on that region, on those people, on the nation. And one of the things that, one of the reasons why those great amendments that you talked about, those Reconstruction amendments, which I agree revolutionized the Constitution, never before has there been that kind of constitutional change happen in such a short period of time. But one of the reasons why that change was eclipsed was because you had all these states passing further acts of discrimination against black people in Mississippi and South Carolina, all over the South, different laws in different jurisdictions that sought to deny black people the very freedom that they got with the abolition of slavery. And Mississippi was, among the worst offenders, if not the worst offender. And so how did you find people who were willing to say, after a century of a dream deferred, we're going to step up and resist these laws, and we're going to work with you to do that? How did you go about finding people who would have the faith to still press on after a century of discrimination, after 2 centuries of discrimination?
Well, once you get the first person in a particular group, say the teachers at the segregated high school, the black high school, Rowan High School, you find the rest of them right there. Once you get your first worker at the major employer, Hercules Powder Company, at that point you get the other workers, you find out about them. You find out who has the courage, who will not be intimidated when they get called up into the general manager's office just before the trial. So if you're going cold into a country, into a particular county rather, then what you do is start with those African Americans who are not dependent on the white community. So you would go to the black minister, you would go to the black undertaker, because they're likely to be able to help you. I think this would be a good time, Tim, for us to show the background of Hattiesburg and Forest County.
Great.
And the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, did some good things, but the documentaries, which were much more in-depth and well done at that point, frankly, than they are today, for the most part, were CBS reports.
CBS reports, right.
And let's do CBS reports in Hattiesburg.
Sure.
This is a polling place in Mississippi, where voting is a sacred trust. This is one of the citizens who can vote. He is John P. Crosswhite, age 70. He lives on a World War I pension, had no formal schooling, taught himself to read and write. He is a qualified voter. The first man he ever voted for was, as he puts it, that fellow Wilson, and he has been voting ever since. This is David Robertson, age 27. He teaches science at Rowan, a segregated Negro high school in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. A graduate of Alcorn A&M College, a veteran of the Korean War, he has, since last spring, been working towards his master's degree in biology at Cornell University under a fellowship provided by the National Science Foundation. When the dean, for instance, would believe that it was the last thing that could be learned about the transmission of those things that we inherit. But Watson and Crick later learned by a method of X-ray diffraction that the gene is made up of
flammable material known as DNA, which is also deoxyribonucleic acid.
David Robertson has tried a number of times to register to vote in Mississippi. Each time, he has been told that he is not qualified because he failed to pass Mississippi's literacy test. Technically then, David Robertson, science teacher, college graduate, master's degree candidate, and a fellow of the National Science Foundation, is illiterate. Theron C. Lind, circuit clerk and voting registrar of Forest County, Mississippi, is one of the most powerful men in America. He and the 81 other county registrars in Mississippi, as well as registrars in Louisiana and other southern states, have the power under state law to decide who can and who cannot vote. It was Theron Lind who ruled that David Robertson was not qualified to vote.
This video anyway WFOR with his first video statement. Now it's 39 years policy broadcasting leadership.
Constable Lee Daniels is proud to be a part of tonight's election returns from Radio Hattiesburg News Central. And in making possible this broadcast, Constable Lee Daniels hopes that you, citizens of Hattiesburg and South Mississippi, will be constantly reminded of your obligation, duty, and basic right to vote. The vote in Hattiesburg and South Mississippi guarantees better government for our section of the country. CBS reports Mississippi on the 15th Amendment is brought to you by Maxwell House Coffee. Good to the last drop. Another fine product of General Foods. CBS reports Mississippi on the 15th Amendment. Now, here is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent David Chopra.
Good evening. This is the Constitution of the United States of America, here at the National Archives in Washington. And this is the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which says, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This 15th Amendment was passed by an overwhelming majority in the Senate and the House in 1869, then signed by President Grant and ratified by 31 of the 37 states and eventually by all the states.
The United States Constitution provides for freedom to vote. And this country must permit every man and woman to exercise their franchise, to shoot, as we saw in the case of Mississippi, two young people who were involved in an effort to register people, to burn churches as a reprisal. With all of the provisions of the United States Constitution, these provisions of the Constitution guaranteeing freedom of worship, the right to vote is very basic. If we're going to neglect that right, then all of our talk about freedom is hollow. And therefore, we shall give every protection that we can to anybody who's seeking to vote. I hope everybody will register in this country. And I hope they will vote. And if it requires extra legislation and extra force, we shall do that.
This is Hattiesburg, Mississippi, county seat of Forest County. It didn't exist until 11 years after the 15th Amendment, but it is perhaps typical of the problem President Kennedy defined. Of the 7,500 Negroes of voting age in Forest County, only 12 of them were adjudged eligible to vote in the 1960 presidential election. If these 12 voted, they represented 0.2% of the adult Negroes in the county. Hattiesburg is the traditional Mississippi town, drenched in magnolia and sweltering summer temperatures. Passenger trains make 4 stops a day. Life and death are totally segregated. Schools, churches, buses, even the cemeteries and the obituary page. This is the home of Mattie Piven, a college junior, age 22, who lives 306 Willis Avenue. This is the county courthouse a mile away. Here, local residents registered to vote. For most Americans, registering is a routine act. But as you watch Mattie Bivens travel a mile between her home and this courthouse, you will be watching a young American citizen in the supreme test of her life. If some of the film is not first quality, it is because there are places in Mississippi where a camera is not welcome.
I was born in the house where I'm living now. I had planned to go down to register the day before. I was thinking as I walked along the dirt road in front of my house about the dust which would be on my shoes and the scars from the rock. And that if we had enough registered voters, Negro registered voters that is, this wouldn't be a problem at all. Because the streets would be paved rather than dirt streets. It was a very hot day. The bus that I got on that morning had many advertisements on the outside. All of these places were places where no Negroes were allowed, whites only. I got on the bus, paid my fare, and walked to the back of the bus. The bus ride from the bus stop to the downtown area was about 12 or 15 minutes long. I got off the bus, crossed the street, and went down to the courthouse. As I started up the steps to the courthouse, I was a little afraid. The registrar, Mr. Lynn, was on his way out. I'm small and he's an extra large man. And he said to me that the lady inside will take care of you. My conversation with the lady in the office was strictly businesslike. I told her my purpose for being there, and she gave me the application to fill out. Along with the application, she gave me a section of the Constitution typed on 2 index cards. She told me that once I began filling out the application, she could not answer any questions concerning it. Once I began filling out the form, I wasn't afraid anymore.
Now, you can bet that no white person would have gotten a section of the Mississippi Constitution long enough to be on 2 index cards. And what we have here, Tim, is David Roberson and Mattie Bivens, David against Goliath, all 350 pounds of foreign land. And who's in the middle? Well, it's a United States District Judge. How did he get there? And I think we all know that in theory, of course, it's the President of the United States who picks judges, trial judges, appellate judges, Supreme Court judges. When you come down to local judges, however, in particular districts, and this applies to the United States Courts of Appeal as well, it really is the senior United States Senator of the same party. And if you have a senior United States Senator who is also the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, as James Eastland was, then he is going to control who gets to be a judge in Mississippi, or the Mississippi judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And he made it very clear to the Kennedys that if William Harold Cox were not appointed, no Kennedy nominee would get out of the committee. And that's how a confirmed racist did get appointed. Now, in his favor was the fact that the American Bar Association, which at that point cared nothing about racial attitudes and rated him as very highly qualified. The other thing was the fact that he had never joined what we refer to as the White Collar Klan, White Citizens Council. He had not done that. And then, from a practical political standpoint, the story goes that when Senator Eastland first ran for office, Judge Cox went to him and said, he was the chairman of the Hinds County Democratic Committee, which includes the state capital of Jackson, and said to him, this is what I need to live on. The rest of it is yours for the campaign. And William Harold Cox took over civil rights litigation from the judicial standpoint in the Southern District of Mississippi.
I noticed both in the book and also in that clip, there's an interesting kind of class discussion going on, right? That they're comparing the guy with no formal education or little formal education who's white, can vote, does vote, with the African-American school teacher who's at the National Science Foundation and getting his master's degree at Cornell teaching. They actually show him teaching, talking about chromosomes and DNA. And in the book you talk about many of the witnesses that you were putting together were teachers, were people who had formal education, were people upstanding citizens. They were people who would be a sort of credit, what in the 19th century and even in the 20th century people would say a credit to their race men and women. And yet this idea of voting rights should be a kind of universal thing, right? I mean, it's everyone is entitled to vote. So talk to me a little bit about the strategy that you put together, because I know from other kinds of challenges to different forms of discrimination, often the witnesses and the people who are brought forward or are used to make the case are people that are unimpeachable in their sort of credentials and their character and so forth. And yet you're appealing for the dismantling of a system of discrimination that would then give universally everyone the rights of citizenship.
You bet. You don't need a master's degree from Cornell in order to be qualified to vote. And we had them, Tim, not just from Cornell, but New York University, Columbia, the main campus of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, West Virginia, Oregon State, all master's degrees, and our teachers had to leave Mississippi in order to get a master's degree because there was no graduate education available for them there. But obviously, you saw Maddie Bivens talk about the dust on her road. If you came out of your house and saw the dust in the black part of town and realized that when you crossed the tracks to the white people's part of town, and that was nice asphalt, something was basically done. And the whole sham of the literacy test. You don't need to be literate, not that every one of our witnesses was not, but you don't need to be literate to know that kind of very basic discrimination that exists. And our workers at the Hercules Powder Company were very fortunate enough to have a shop steward who cared about them getting to vote. And Huck Dunnigan was his name. He was white. And he told his workers, you go down and you keep going, and I will see you don't get fired. And Huck Dunnigan lived up to his word. One of the interesting sidelights is that his niece is now the president of the University of Southern Mississippi. Right in Hattiesburg. I think we, at some point, we just want to make clear that we are talking about 1962. And things have improved throughout the South, and specifically, certainly in Mississippi, where the mayor of Hattiesburg, Johnny Dupree, was the Democratic nominee. The governor, he lost predictably because, as you well know, the racial juxtaposition is such now that white people are Republicans and black people are Democrats in the state of Mississippi.
Which is the reverse of what it used to be.
Which is indeed the reverse. Well, black people didn't get to vote, so
right, well, that's, fair enough. You know, one of the, I think, remarkable parts of the story of race relations in the United States, and certainly of the civil rights movement more specifically, is a story about the conversion of people to a kind of social justice orientation. People moving from one kind of way of thinking, whether it be racist or sort of moderate, or someone who might be complicit in a system even though they don't know they're complicit in a system of racism, to a different kind of orientation, an embrace of integration, an embrace of black people, toleration of black people, depending on where they started out. And I think you can also see that story taking place within the Kennedy administration, right? An administration which began, according to you, with where you say that civil rights was scarcely a priority for John F. Kennedy, the Kennedy administration. certainly during the election and even subsequent to that. And yet you worked in Robert Kennedy's Justice Department. And there was definitely a shift that took place, even in the short amount of time that John F. Kennedy was president, and certainly under Johnson it goes even further. But there was a shift happening at the federal level, and particularly in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. What do you think caused that shift? Why do you think they were so slow to the civil rights cause to begin with? But once they did move in that direction, what caused it? What were the kinds of things that you saw or heard being moving the various people that you knew in Washington?
Of course, when President Kennedy was in the Senate and Robert Kennedy was a staffer in the Senate, labor racketeering was a major thrust for them, and the dealing with corruption, but again, particularly in the labor movement. And the classic example of going slow was the stroke of the pen in terms of housing discrimination, which was not done immediately, and I think not until well into the second year of the administration. But the Kennedys were politicians, and they respected the right to vote. And on his first day as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy went into John Doerr's office, and John had become, in the stroke of January 20th, the acting Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. They went into his office, and Robert Kennedy said, "Show me what you're doing. Show me where cases are filed. Show me the counties that you have under investigation." And he cared about that. And I think in terms of President Kennedy's attitudes, we saw, as the video indicated, assaults on black people who were trying to vote, on those who were trying to assist them in the voting process. And ultimately, the murder of Medgar Evers, a terrific human being, a veteran of World War II, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP for the state of Mississippi. And I was with Medgar right where he was shot the week before. But that was the night in his driveway. Yeah, that was really the start of what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was named the Act of 1963 when it was proposed by President Kennedy in June of 1963.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about the oral history work that you did in this book, the interviews that you did. And I've done a fair amount of oral history myself, and one of the things that strikes me is how, in many cases, how grateful the folks are who you're going to interview, right? That many of them don't see themselves as historical actors, as being important enough to have on record, to archive somewhere, and to make sure that their stories are recorded. And I'm always struck by that because, of course, the first bit of oral history I did was for a long civil rights movement project at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we were going to interview a whole bunch of folks who were active in the desegregation battles and the busing battles in Louisville and Birmingham and Greensboro and some other places throughout the South. And I was always struck by these people who I was so excited to go, I was a young graduate student, I was so excited to go interview them because they had made the history that I was studying. Right? And yet so many of them over and over, particularly the black folks who were doing all of this heroic work as you opened up talking about, really didn't see themselves as agents of change, and yet they absolutely are. But yet these oral histories are things that are also able to teach a younger generation of people, students that I teach now, about that period, which is so distant to them. It might as well be the Middle Ages, right, for some of them. When these students think Ronald Reagan is ancient history, much less the civil rights. I mean, and we won't go into that. That's another conversation. But what is it about interviewing these folks, getting their voices down, capturing their stories, telling this story, weaving together a narrative? What is important about that to you?
Well, of course, by the time I did these interviews, they had been voting for several decades. So it was bringing back, as they referred to it, the civil rights days, and that was a term that was used by a number of my witnesses. But I think, Tim, that they did regard themselves as change agents. And they never missed the opportunity to vote and were disturbed over young people not thinking it was worthwhile to vote and the difficulty that they had in doing that. One of the in the last, only one, David Roberson of the original 16 African-American witnesses is still alive. And David teaches in Chicago. He's retired now, actually, from his teaching, but a real Renaissance person who benefited while he was in the Army during the Korean War from the libraries that he had. He read books and listened to classical music for the first time. But he is the only survivor of the original 16.
Yeah, it's interesting when you answered my question. One of the things that struck me is that you going to interview them now is a very different dynamic between you interviewing them. They know you, they know your history, you're from, you experienced that era. I think some of the surprise that I was seeing as a young graduate student going down to interview people who had made this history, I think they weren't so much in a place that they couldn't see themselves as historical change agents, but they were surprised that someone my age would actually care to listen to them or wanted to hear that story. That might have actually been more of the dynamic, not that they didn't see themselves as change agents, but that they were surprised that I saw them as change agents or no care.
When I did a Southern book tour, when the book was initially published in Hattiesburg, in Jackson, in Memphis, we had children, nieces, nephews of the witnesses. Many of them didn't know one another when they arrived, but they were so grateful that the accomplishments of their forebears was being recognized, that accomplishment was being recognized. And in Memphis, for example, a young man named Reggie Howes in his early 30s told me that he was 3 when his grandfather, the Reverend Sam Ball, one of our 16, died. And he said, I never knew he was a hero. And it's very satisfying to me that Reggie Howes knows that Sam Ball was a hero.
One of my heroes is Dr. Robert Coles, the famed child psychiatrist here at Harvard, who got his start doing the work that he was doing that became his famous multi-volume Children of Crisis series. He was stuck in a traffic jam in New Orleans when Ruby Bridges was desegregating, single-handedly desegregating the New Orleans public school system in 1960. And he interviewed her, and then that inspired him to sort of write this great series of books about how children develop resilience during those moments.
And Ruby Bridges' teacher, Barbara Henry, lives in this stretch.
Oh, right, that's right, that's exactly right. And one of the things that Bob told me, one of Professor Coles told me when I was in college studying with him, is I developed this interest in African American history and civil rights and social justice, and I was reading a lot of these texts, Flannery O'Connor and Faulkner and Ellison and Richard Wright and so forth, in his courses and in courses that I took with other professors like him. But one thing that struck me when I was a senior, he said to me, you have this deep interest in race, this deep commitment to anti-racism. You have to go south. And it was one of those, he said, go south, young man. And I kind of looked at him and I said, but I'm studying the South. He said, no. You need to go south to understand America. Because the story of race in America resides in the South. And the only way you can understand this country is if you do that. And I wanted for you to, do you agree with that?
Well, sure. No, I think so. I think you mentioned my having taught for a year at the University of Mississippi School of Law in Oxford. And Oxford is a very sophisticated community of about 12,000 that jumps to 75 to 80,000 on football Saturdays. But I was going down to the Delta to interview the editor of a paper in Indianola in the Sunflower County, Senator Eastland's county, Judge Cox's county. And the editor said, now Gordon, you just remember, 6 miles out of Oxford, you're back in Mississippi. And it's very right indeed. Let's take a look at the second part of CBS Reports video, because it shows another one of our witnesses, and I haven't mentioned, except from a starting point, ministers. And this is the Reverend Wayne Kelly Pittman.
This is a polling place in Mississippi.
You want number 2,
Where
not number 1. And And this, I remember, was filmed during the contempt trial, and I'll put that in chronological perspective a little later. Dave, I do have another copy of it if you want to try, if you're having trouble with that one. You'll hear a difference in terms of the number of blacks that were registered, because as the first video said, we had only 12 out of 7,500 adult African Americans who were registered at the time of the first trial, which was a 3-day trial, early March of 1962. And you'll have a mention of up to 30, and that's after we got a court order and 5 months had passed.
More than double.
We're good to go.
Go for it.
The Reverend Wayne K. Pittman is pastor of the East Pine Circuit AME Church. Since 1954, he has tried repeatedly to register to vote in Hattiesburg, where he has lived all his life.
Why do you want to vote? Well, I believe that voting is a prerequisite to first-class citizenship. And then it has a lot to do with the consciousness of a person being an American in its entirety. And then I believe that if I become a qualified voter along with other Negroes here in Mississippi, that we will be able to speak and get certain things that we feel that we are entitled to. But a voteless person is a hopeless person. We have nothing to do with their entering office. We have nothing to do with their tenure of office. They feel and know that they're not obligated to us. And then again, it makes you feel that what the civil government represents for all of its people will include you too. We are taught one thing in our classroom and then experience different things on our street. We wonder who is right and who is wrong. It's confusing.
I've heard it said in the Deep South that if Negroes are permitted to vote, they will take over the government. What do you answer when people say things like that?
I don't believe the Negro is that strong, and I definitely know that our government is not that weak.
After 5 literacy tests, all rated unsatisfactory, Reverend Pittman finally made it this summer. This came after Registrar Lynch had been ordered by a federal court judge to review a handful of Negro applicants who had testified in a Justice Department suit. Reverend Pittman thus became one of fewer than 30 qualified Negro voters in all of Forest County.
So we did get up to 30, and it only took 5 months. Let me tell you a little bit about the trial. I told you only about the 16 African-American witnesses and their variety. And you see Reverend Pittman, the teachers, we've talked about all their master's degrees, the workers at the Hercules Powder Company supported by their shop steward, Huck Dunnigan, the leaders of the further little chapter of the NCAA, Herman Daly, who died, and B.F. Ford, and we may show you a picture of him later. So we decided right before the trial that we were going to have matching, as we referred to them, matching white witnesses, one for each of the blacks, who by simply walking into the registrar's office got to register to vote. And Bob Owen, who was my section chief, and I, we had no records. There was a records demand statute that had been passed in 1960, but Judge Cox would not give us any records. He would do it either under the 1960 Act or under the basic discovery provisions of the lawsuit that we filed against Registrar Lynn. So how are you going to get these white witnesses? And we went to the Hattiesburg Public Library. We were limited to the period that Lynn had been the circuit clerk, even though his predecessor, Luther Cox, had been, if anything, worse than library, we figured out who would have become the age of 21, the voting age at that time, of the graduates of Hattiesburg High School. We went through the yearbooks. There was no major office of the FBI in the state of Mississippi at that point. That occurred only during Freedom Summer 2 years later with the murder of Goodman, Schroeder, and Cheney. But the New Orleans office was available to us, and regardless of the problems that J. Edgar Hoover had with civil rights, and I haven't seen the new movie as yet, Tim. I don't know whether civil rights is dealt with in it or not. It would be interesting to see. But agents do their job, and you just have to make it very clear to them what that job is. In his great book on Kennedy Justice, Victor Navasky refers to interrogative overkill. And that's what we did by laying out every question we wanted the FBI agents to ask of these potential white witnesses. In name, address, age, schooling. When did you first go down to the circuit clerk's office? Who went with you? What happened when you went in the door? What did she say or he say? And what did you say? And what help did you get? Don't really give a conclusionary one like that quite so soon, but you get the idea. And the FBI did its job, and out of their 300 interviews, we picked 16 whites whom we would subpoena to go in to say that in the first 2 years that Lynn had been the registrar, a white person just walked in and signed the book. In the third year, he did or she did have to take a literacy test, but it wasn't any card, any section that needed 2 cards. It was something straightforward and simple. There shall be no imprisonment for debt. It was a standard in section 30.
I wanted to talk a little bit, if you could. I want to go way back, and then I want to move forward. And you were, obviously a very bright young man. You were trained at all the best schools. You went to law school. You passed the bar. You went to work for the Justice Department. Your promising career. Was Hattiesburg, Mississippi, sort of the next step to your kind of ambition as a lawyer? Is this, or were you imbued with a sense of justice, a sense of that this kind of thing was wrong, that you wanted to use the law to make sure that it was a tool for social change, to promote freedom and equality and basic civil rights for all people? Is this something that you had in you when you went to law school and to the Justice Department, or was this something that was sort of activated in you as a result of this experience in Mississippi?
Well, I'd always been interested in politics and government, and if a young lawyer has the opportunity to deal with the greatest social wrong that exists in the country at that time, you're going to do it. And I was just very pleased to have the opportunity that John Doerr and Bert Marshall gave me.
And what advice would you have for my students right now? Who half of them want to go to law school, half of them want to go to law school because it's the sort of default option. They're not quite sure why they want to go to law school, but they want to go. And then I have a whole bunch of students that want to go to law school to change the world, who believe that the law can be a progressive force for good in our society. And certainly there are many examples of it being just that. You obviously know that better than I do. And so what advice do you have for them to make sure that they can carve out a career where they're not going to end up at some white shoe firm doing corporate law in a way that isn't going to satisfy their desire to kind of change the world in the way that they may go into law school thinking that they want to change it? What advice do you have for them?
Well, the first advice I have is don't regard law as the default option. I think too many people think, oh, you can't go wrong going to law school. It's going to be, you're going to learn things in some way or another that will be useful. There are a lot of ways that you can deal with social injustice that exists. And certainly in business, you can do it by creating business opportunities. In medicine, you see doctors without borders, and in every profession, there are ways that you can deal with injustice. I think frankly, this is a very difficult employment period for law students. And I think one is better looking for a period of time.
Of President Obama in 2008 is evidence of that one example of how far we've come. That would have been unimaginable in the country, to anyone in the country, when you began the work that you were doing in Mississippi, and I totally recognize and get that. But we also are in a country where the first black president has met with unbelievable, not just opposition, but obstruction, both in the popular culture and in the halls of Congress, that I do not believe has nothing to do with his race. We have a country where the inequality actually between white people and black people has actually grown in some ways in terms of material measures from the time you began your work in Mississippi to the present day. 40% of African American children grow up in poverty in this country, right? That we have an enormous amount of problems in this country directly related to our sort of race problem, right? Which has always been America's kind of crucible. And, you know, and I mentioned the work that I do in the South. I've been rebuilding black churches that have been burned down by arsonists for the last 15 years. Every year I'd like to take a vacation, and every year there's another church to rebuild. Churches that weren't burned in 1962, churches that were burned in 2002. 2008, the last church that we worked on. And so we still have these problems, and a lot of these problems are located in the South, although not exclusively. So what do you account for the lack of progress in some areas, given the fact that we've had enormous progress made in the law, that we've had enormous progress made by certain kinds of folks, but not all folks? What do you account for some lack of progress? Is it just that we can't get over race in this country, that race is always going to be our crucible, we're never going to get over, we're never going to reach the promised land?
Well, I hope ultimately we will. You know, in her opinion in the University of Michigan case, Justice O'Connor gave it a 25-year period. Now, she picked 25 years, I think, because it had been 25 years between the Bakke decision at UC Davis Medical School and the Bruder versus Bollinger decisions at the University of Michigan Law School. So that was sort of pulled out of the hat. If I really thought that racism would be gone in what's left of that 25-year period, I'd be very happy. There's no question that the fallacy of those who said, well, we have a black president now, that means we've solved the race problem at a time when adolescent African-American boys, to be redundant, have a greater chance of being under some form of penal restraint than of attending a four-year college. It is a tragedy. Now, I think that minorities historically have always been hurt worse during an economic downturn. And I think the poverty level that you've spoken of is a part of that. And the other thing is that the implementation of law is crucial, but it doesn't accomplish everything. It doesn't give opportunities in the same way that it should, and it is a very distressing thing to.
Yeah, it's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing to implement it, right?
Yeah.
And make sure that it gets implemented properly. And that's been true throughout our history. That's not just with respect to voting rights. Let me turn for a second to voting rights, because you obviously are part of the history of expanding voting rights in this country. This book is, as I said, a stirring account of one of those major episodes and dramas. We have currently in this country, the last election, of course, had the highest voter turnout we've had in presidential election in recent history. And yet there's all sorts of gloom and doom predictions that the voting rolls will go down again and so forth. But there are also very intentional and deliberate efforts that are being advanced throughout this country. Maine just defeated one in a special election, exclusively engineered by Republican parties at the state level to try and restrict voting rights yet again, to find different creative ways to make sure that people can't vote, same-day voting, requiring certain forms of ID for elderly folks, and this disproportionately affects, in some areas, African-American voters. And there are all of these different ways and movements of what I think I heard some statistics the other day, that 32 states right now are currently, or something like that, several dozen states are currently entertaining pieces of legislation at the state level that will actually diminish the number of people who can vote, will actually create new barriers to entry to vote in the next election. And what do you, as someone who was instrumental to expanding voting rights for African Americans and by extension all Americans, frankly, what do you have to say about 2011? We got folks who are trying to restrict the number of people who can actually participate in the democratic process.
And we've gone through, I think, a general upswing in terms of participation, an upswing in terms of access to the polls, and there's no question that in this period of time, it really began with the Indiana case, which did go to the United States Supreme Court, and Georgia, but it now is expanded to two-thirds almost of our states. And I think it's very sad for any public official or any party to be afraid of the electorate, to be afraid of the franchise being extended, because we want people to participate in the same way that our teachers, workers, ministers, NAACP officials did in Forest County. And one of the problems that we have, wholly apart from the legislative movement that you've well described, is making young people believe and understand that their vote counts. Now, we had a state representative election the last go-round in Massachusetts, which was a tie. Which was a tie at 5,200 votes each in that particular district. Well, it certainly should be very clear to anybody that one vote can count. And then the other aspect is whether or not that young person will believe that his or her vote is worth counting, worth being counted, that the impact from it will be felt.
Yeah. I just got in an argument the other day with a young man, a 24-year-old guy, who did vote for the first time in a presidential election in 2008, voted for Obama, said he wasn't voting this time around. Now, I've been in that place, right? I've definitely been. In 1996, I voted for Bill Clinton in my first presidential election in 1992, and I was angry at Bill Clinton for selling out all sorts of promises that he had made during the campaign, the crime bill, the welfare reform bill, don't ask, don't tell. I mean, we could get into that. But I was very upset. I'm not going to vote, And yet, every time I think of contemplate, from a place of anger, I'm not going to vote, I think about the folks who were assassinated, were killed, were murdered in the struggle for this. I think about the people who lost their lives trying to escape from slavery to freedom. I think about all of those women at Seneca Falls who had the first idea about women's suffrage, none of whom lived to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was finally ratified. And I think about all the lost souls, right, who didn't make it to the place where they could actually exercise the most basic freedom, the most basic right of citizenship of suffrage. And I always go vote, even if I'm dissatisfied, even if I'm angry. I remember the snaking lines in South Africa, right? Watching that on television when I was in first year of graduate school, when Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. It so gives me chills to think about those snaking lines of people who walked days, in some cases, to go to voting booths. And then I think about this kid sitting on a couch telling me that he's pissed off at Obama, so he's not going to vote. It makes me just crazy. It must make you crazy, too.
You mentioned my wife, Stephanie,
Yes.
and when our youngest child was born, Stephanie was released from the hospital on a day of a special election for Wardle and we went to the polls before going home. She was not going to miss
I love it.
voting.
Well, I'll tell you another, not the same story, actually, a different end of life. My grandfather had a stroke in the fall of 2008 and was in the hospital and died, less than a year, about a year later. And he voted absentee ballot for Barack Obama from the hospital because it was he had never missed an election. Never missed an election. I think when we first met, I told that story.
Yeah.
I told that story, and I asked him why he did it. Because I voted for you. right? This is about your future. This is not about me anymore. It's about you. And I remember being so moved by that, so moved by that kind of example. And so this sort of fight for voting rights is so important. This history is so important. So my last question, and I'm going to open it up for some folks, is the President of the United States, right? When you went to Mississippi in the early 1960s, it would have been unimaginable to you and all those black folks that you were working with to think about a black President of the United States. And for much of my life, it has been kind of unimaginable in some way, at least half of it. And yet here we are, right? And we have a black President of the United States. And he's struggling.
He is struggling.
So what do you make of our president?
Well, of course, you have to view the totality, Tim. You have to view his appointments. And I think I have come slowly, probably too slowly, to realize he's not a liberal. He's a centrist. And that he wasted the first year of his presidency by trying to get cooperation from the Republicans in the Congress. I think that you have to view not just him as an individual, you have to view his appointments, you have to think about Ken Sullivan and the cabinet, you have to think of why in God's name did he take Janet Napolitano out of Arizona and create Jan Brewer as a national figure. The whole aspect of making appointments of people who still had terms to serve, who were competent, and she was a competent governor, she had been a competent U.S. attorney. I'm on a committee that deals with coordination in terms of juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, so I see Eric Holder several times a year. I think he has done many good things. There are things that I would change if I could. I don't like the fact that there has been a death penalty prosecution in the state of Vermont that does not have the death penalty. I think that it is sad that the inspiration that Barack Obama instilled in all of us in 2008 is not highly evident in 2011. I think he's working hard. I think he is a good, competent president. He's not the kind of inspirational leader that I had hoped he would be.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, given our political process now, that
May not be possible.
that we are ever going to have that kind of person
just
in that office. I mean, when I think about what the circus sideshow that is the Republican primary right now, I mean, it may be our system that is impeding the sort of production of truly inspiring.
Would you like to look at the pictures that?
Sure, yeah, let's do that, and then we'll open it up for
and because I think there are some interesting ones, and one in particular. Okay, so here we are, and I had mentioned the Reverend Sam Hall, one of the Hercules workers. He was also a minister, and worked a full work week, and then went off to preach 30 miles out of town at Summerall Baptist Church. B.F. Bourne, the co-chair of the NAACP chapter in Forest County, had a market on Mobile Street right in the heart of Black Hattiesburg. He was the person who hosted the barn for Clyde Kennard when Clyde Kennard attempted to be the first African American to attend what was then Mississippi Southern.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah. So when you have a lot of witnesses, and I think, Tim, you described well the criteria that go into witness selection, and you don't want to limit it to teachers, but on the other hand, you want to lead with somebody that would make an impression, if any impression could have been made on Judge Cox. And you're building a record for the great judges that Dwight Eisenhower appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And we led with Jesse Stigall, and that at the top is a picture of Stigall at the time of the trial, and down below with his I Love Dawson School t-shirt, Jesse, when I went back to interview him. And the word feisty, that adjective is what I applied to Eloise Hobson. Her master's degree was from Columbia. She was irreverent in the extreme. Now, black people couldn't just get turned down when they went to register to vote. They had to come back and be told they'd been turned down. So, first of all, you had to get to fill out the form. Often it would take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trips before there and then would fill out the application form. And then you were supposed to go back and be told you were rejected. The big NQ for not qualifying at the time. And she never went back. But she knew she should have. And she testified that she had gone back and been told she was turned down. She smiled at me when I came back to see her. I didn't obviously know this in 1962. But when I went back and talked to her, she smiled at me and said, "I lied like a trooper." And Addie Berger, the principal's wife, just below Eloise Hobson. And she didn't lie like a trooper. She did everything she should. And a terrific woman. And the Reverend Wendell Phillips Taylor is on the top with Mrs. Taylor. And he is the son of a Methodist minister, and his brother Harris was the first Methodist minister to African-American minister to be bishop of a predominantly white congregation in New Jersey. And there's David Roberson, whom you've seen in the video, with 2 of his students at Roberto Clemente Community Academy in Chicago. And up at the top is T.F. Williams. And T.F. Williams is a little dynamo living in a suburb, Palmer's Crossing, just outside of Hattiesburg. When the Bobby Chain, the mayor of Hattiesburg at that time, cut off the water supply at Palmer's Crossing, he started his own water company. He was also the head of the St. Francis subsidized housing, and we all know how important that is. Now, just below is Willie Thigpen with Mrs. Thigpen and her pet, and he was a veteran of World War II. When I went back to talk to him, talked about what he did in the Lido Road from China to India. We also talked about whether it was worthwhile to take the risks that he had. And he looked at me and said, "Boy, was it ever. Now I go into the store, the white man comes in, I don't have to step aside. And when I get up to the counter, they don't call me boy, they call me Mr. Thigpen." And there's Theron Lynn, found guilty of contempt. Not sure why it took the court so long to make the decision. It actually took from September to July of 1963.
They were trying to build a bigger cell, I think.
I don't know, but he was the first Southern registrar to be found guilty of contempt of civil contempt that they decided. And you see the date in July of 1963. Now, he was succeeded, Theron Lynn was succeeded by a woman who was an assistant, Marion Brown, and she was a total innocent, totally apolitical. It wasn't easy to get new employees when he was being sued, and she joined the staff in 1962. Mother of 3 sets of twins, not a radical in any way. She never hired a black assistant. She hired her daughters in the best tradition of county government. But she was a decent human being who gave T.F. Williams voting forms that he could take to Priest Creek Missionary Baptist Church, his church, and have filled out as a starter there. And R.C. Jones was a mentor of David Roberson and a faculty member at Alcorn. One interesting thing about Forest County was the fact that the black professionals in Forest County had not waited for the Justice Department to turn up or SNCC to be created, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They had brought suit themselves in the early 1950s. Now, it was a time, however, before the appointment of Elbert Tuttle, of John Brown, of John Minor Wisdom by President Eisenhower. And they lost. They lost. But the fact that they had that initiative was something that was built on, and it gave that kind of basis to what came later. And I think it's important in terms of our teacher witnesses just to note that when the South challenged the Voting Rights Act, and they had to have a Voting Rights Act, because the progress from 12 registered voters to 30 over 5 months, when you think of 82 counties in Mississippi, 128 in Georgia, all those parishes in Louisiana, we would still be dealing on a county-by-county basis today if we had not done the radical step of taking the vote away from the states. And that's what we did. And when the case was challenged by South Carolina in the case called South Carolina versus Katzenbach, Chief Justice Warren referred to our teacher witnesses as an indication of why something radical was needed. And there's a picture of Sam Hall. The first picture was his initial employment picture for Hercules. I went to the corporate headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware, and the general counsel was nice enough to go through the files of our witnesses and give me the earlier picture. Here is Reverend Hall when he retired. And below him is the first person to break the employment code at Hercules. Richard Boyd. Richard Boyd was chosen by Huck Dunnigan to be the first African American in a, quote, white man's job. What did that mean? That meant a skilled job that paid a higher salary, not basic labor. And he, Mr. Boyd, testified in a later trial that he had gone 50 times to the previous registrar, Rutherford Cox, before Cox had registered him. And that Cox finally said, "Why do you keep bothering me? Why do you keep bothering me?" And Mr. Boyd said that he went to statewide Masonic meetings, and the other Masons in Jackson kept saying, "Why aren't you registered to vote?" Well, Cox muttered about what those so-and-sos could do, but he let him register. These are two pictures of me with different people who helped. The first is a priest, a Polish-American priest, Father John Israel, and he was the person who was at Sacred Heart Church in Hattiesburg when I first went there to see if I could get help from my own church. And he came up with one of our white witnesses, the daughter of the Hattiesburg florist, and she did testify. Years later, I was teaching for a semester at the University of San Diego, and she was living in San Diego, and I tried to get her to talk to me, but she wouldn't do it. And below is T.F. Williams. And again, not only the housing aspect, the water aspect, but when segregation, or integration rather, finally came to Forest County, he was on the advisory committee for a different federal judge. We were all white, that initial group of lawyers. Why would that be? It certainly wasn't because there was discrimination in the hiring process, but there was no place for an African American to stay. This was still 2 years before Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. But that couldn't go on. And John Doe was a graduate of Bolt Hall, the Berkeley Law School, and he got the dean to recommend one of his students, and Kelton Henderson, the top picture, is now a United States District Judge in San Francisco, and he is, one of his many cases is health care for the prisoners of the California penal system.
And there's a social justice institute at Berkeley named after him.
There is indeed, yep. And the one great judge of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals who predated the Eisenhower administration was Richard Reeves. And he, along with Tuttle, Wisdom, and Brown, formed what scornfully was referred to as the Four. And they were the Four, and you know that panels are normally, hearing cases, 3-judge panels. If we had 2 of the 4 on a panel, we would be pretty sure that justice would prevail. And at the bottom of the last slide was John Doerr. And he was nice enough to come and speak with me when I spoke at the Kennedy Library. And there's Judge Tuttle on the left, Judge Brown on the right, a very moving picture at the bottom. And that's Vernon Dahmer Jr. on the extreme right, sitting with 2 relatives and looking at the television set as Barack Obama was sworn in as President of the United States. And John Minor Wisdom, the 4th of the 4. Vernon Dahmer in the middle, a martyr. And the crowd that gathered in front of the church on the morning of his funeral. And at the top, Bert Marshall, not somebody who had been involved in civil rights, but who had all the right motivations and was a great antitrust lawyer with Robert Kennedy. Now, the great political cartoonist of the Washington Post, Herb Block, autographed that cartoon for me in 1961 when I went to Washington. And you can see, maybe a little too far away to see, the language, "You mean so? Let the legal ballots in the same box with ours?" And that's a registrar cringing back as a Justice Department official moves into the
He
office.
looks like Superman.
Yeah, right. And Reverend Pittman, you have seen in the video. And there's Huck Dunnigan, smiling because he did what he wanted to do. One big, tough guy, an all-state lineman, basketball player in high school. Huck Dunnigan cared about it. And you know, labor unions are being attacked all over the place these days. But what Huck Dunnigan did as shop steward of their union is something that I will always remember, and I hope will be remembered.
Very moving.
And I think that lines up being a great pictures.
Thank you for that, Gordon. I appreciate it. And why don't we open it up if anybody has questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Judge Lori,
Yeah.
first, thank you for coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there, during your childhood, there was an experience or a seminal moment that motivated you to do civil rights.
I think that I acquired more and more a sense of justice as I grew up. And I think I became conscious of it first. It's funny, in studying Greek in Oxford Latin, I had the teacher who spoke a lot about morality, and I think something got through me. I think that was the start, and the scholarship that I had in law school was a public service scholarship, and I had as my tutor here at Harvard in the government department, the man whose book, written in 1949, is still as great a treatment of the South as exists, D.O. Key. He was my thesis tutor, and I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from a congressional candidate. I was the student chairman of the second campaign that Jackson Holtz ran for Congress in 1956. He was a great mentor for me, as at a later point, Judge Appadari. So it wasn't one particular moment. I think it was a steady, ongoing kind of thing. And I had an aunt who raised me. My mother died when I was 6, and the aunt, her older sister who raised me, I think instilled good virtues in me.
Do another one? Yeah, go. Yeah. Let's-
Yes.
You said how the Kennedys came a little later to the civil rights movement. Well, I remember in 1961, the Woodworths at Harvard Square. People who, well, some freedom riders, but you could certainly sit in at Woodworths to stimulate fair treatment for Woodworths himself. And I couldn't see how JFK could miss that right
Yeah.
under his Cambridge nose.
I have one of those vintage, those flyers
Right.
in my office, actually, one of those Woolworth Solidarity
I don't
Series.
know what was happening in the rest of the country, but that was pretty consistent.
Yeah.
Harvard Square.
Yeah.
It must have been 61.
I think it was 61, yeah,
Right,
it was.
right,
Yeah.
right. And I was impressed when people would go in shifts
Yeah.
and right in his own town. I would think we woke him up a little after he got through the racketeering.
Yeah.
Or continued.
And Greensboro and Nashville
Yeah.
and the
whole movement. City.
the Freedom Riders who have been immortalized by PBS in their documentary earlier this year. Seeing John Siegenthaler very close to Robert Kennedy and an assistant at the time being bludgeoned in the Alabama riot had a big effect.
Well, in the Birmingham campaign too, later on, they were watching that on television.
Right. But I think you're right. I think it was a steady kind of thing. And then on the day that he did make the proposal for the Civil Rights Act of 1963, the murder of Medgar Evers, which woke up the Catholic Church in Mississippi. Not that it was a significant factor numerically in Mississippi, but Cardinal Law, who was then the editor of the Mississippi Register, had been a major courageous figure in the state of Mississippi, marching when churches were burned, or synagogues burned, and the editorials that he did. I did when he became the Archbishop of Boston. I did an op-ed piece for the Globe on his editorials record there.
Yeah.
So Professor Carr at Stanford Law School is doing recently written about civil rights and law, and he warns us about the danger of approaching civil rights from a very court-based system. I was wondering if you agree or disagree with him. And even from my own example, he's talking about when I graduated from undergrad, I thought I want to go to law school and it was civil rights and social justice. But I decided against it. Actually working in Greensboro for the long bill organizer. How do you get? I guess that's my question is, do you agree or disagree, or do you think you need to move more to grassroots organizing for civil rights?
And what is his thesis?
His thesis is that Obama and the current generation believes that it's very court-based. It's trying to be achieved through litigation. So
Right.
I think there should be more focus on grassroots organizing, community organizing, getting people on the ground, shaping hearts and minds and such, versus working on these long cases that sometimes get a little overlooked.
Well, I'm a big believer in multitasking, and I don't think one is exclusive from the other.
Yeah.
And I think that on any case, the initial move for equitable relief, for a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction, often really decides the case in terms of what you are attempting to achieve. And that, I think, there's no reason not to use it. We don't want to give up on litigation, because if there is a discernible goal that can be accomplished through it, or maybe, there are no guarantees in many cases that you bring, but going ahead and litigating, I think, is very good. And at the same time, having the kind of popular upswell that can influence Congress, that can influence legislation. I think that's terribly important too. And not just Congress, but one's state legislature, and in some instances, city council, dealing with ordinances that may be discriminatory.
The other thing about the law, which I'll add is sort of footnote to what you just said, is that once laws are in place, when they're violated, the movements can always use them as an example of a dream deferred or of hypocrisy in the country or what have you. So, you know, the Declaration of Independence, right, written by a slaveholder, has the words all men are created equal in it. And so the slaves were able to say, you know what, you said that. It's there. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are in the Constitution. And they may have been violated, and southern states may have come up with all sorts of creative ways, both legally and extra-legally, to violate those laws. But those laws are there. And then the Civil Rights Movement is able to draw on that for inspiration, which I think is really important. So, I mean, once laws are there, even if they're violated, they can serve as a kind of touchstone for grassroots movements that are trying to make good on the promises of laws that already exist when they're in the face of discrimination or violation.
The court decision, which was the result of litigation in this Commonwealth on gay marriage, is the same, had the force of law. And I think those initially opposed to gay marriage realized that the world did not collapse by that being the law in Massachusetts. And the same thing with the statute. If you have nominally forced equality, and it occurs in terms of job opportunity, possibly, or public accommodations, the world didn't end because black people got to go into the theater as well as white people. Remember Maddie Bivens talking about that silly, goofy ad and the other ads on the bus, all of which at that point she couldn't do and other black people could not do. But once people go in, the world doesn't die, and it doesn't collapse. And that makes a big impression, just as the statement made to the slaveholder.
Yeah.
Make a statement.
I will say that the Goodrich decision, the only thing that it's done for me, in addition to giving me the right to marry, is made me more boring. I'm much more boring now as a result of that. Other comments? Yeah.
I'm interested in this question as well. I was originally going to ask a different version of this, but this question of policy change, legislative change on the one hand, and culture change works on the other hand, and how we see one preceding the other. Brown versus Board of Education coming far before the cultural change work that was made possible. And on the other hand, you know, again, back to sexual orientation, thinking about Lawrence and Warner, thinking about repeal, don't ask, don't help, how much the culture has changed in the last 15 years that the law and policy are so far behind catching up. And even today, trying to make sense of, you know, think about that question with today's passage by the Massachusetts State Senate of the Transgender Equal Rights Bill.
Yes.
So, you know, I spend a lot of time thinking about that from the culture side, culture change work side, and from the grassroots organizing side. But thinking about policy change work, thinking about legal decision-making and legislative work, where specifically do you see that, how have you seen that culture change work influencing that, you know, the sausage-making of legislation and judicial decisions? You know, and what decisions, how do you see that changing the process? What examples have really stood out to you? And I've got another follow-up question sort of related to that.
Well, I mean, you go back as you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education, and of course, the impact was actually faster in terms of related public things than schools. In Mississippi, there was no integration even of staffs for 15 years, and we had what most people viewed as a watering down in the second Brown decision, all deliberate speed. But while that was going on, or not going on, there was integration of parks, of beaches, and the impact of the Brown decision. I'm not sure it's cultural in the sense that you were using the term, but in terms of one's daily life, it had a very greater impact than just the pure educational aspect that it did. Culture doesn't move as fast, obviously, and it's a question of experience. And if you have the experience that I was referring to, giving just our gay marriage example in Massachusetts, if you take the continuing opposition of the Catholic Church for example, that opposition is not mirrored in the practicing Catholics of this state or other states.
And sort of another question that's made me think about is
Yeah.
how, over the last half century, virtually every other progressive social movement in the United States, the liberal social movement, has looked to the Black civil rights movement as, we are like this. So whether it's other race-based movements, the Mexican American movement, whether we're looking at feminism in its myriad forms, whether we're looking at the gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement, disability rights, immigrant movements, and so on, we could, there's this language of how do we build on that? How useful is that looking back and moving forward? This kind of model of, we have this group, well, and sort of, I'm still trying to fully articulate this plan, because we've struggled with this monopoly of just the, more and more niches, sort of like, okay, we're adding somebody else gets a room in the multicultural resource center out of college, or one more group on the list of, legally protected classes, all of which are important, and yet I'm still struggling with, many people are struggling with legally and culturally, how do we move forward and actually get at the structures of change?
Well, in terms of the reference back, though, to the civil rights movement at the beginning of the question, I think what Tim was saying is speaking about these 30 or 32 states that are trying to limit access. The analogy you can draw back to what occurred in the South in the 1960s is a very useful one. We fought as a nation, ultimately, to provide access. And the whole phantom of street fraud, which may have existed half a century ago, but certainly doesn't exist now by any discernible way. It's so ridiculous in terms of the absence of concrete example that I think it's very useful to be able to refer back to the fact that we did at one point in our country fight hard for access to the polls, and it's so important to have that and not let it be trifled with by partisan legislators.
You want to ask a question? You sure? Okay. All right, Gordon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For everything you've done historically and now, and thanks for being here at Kennedy School.
All right.
Good.
Good.